The man known to history as King Stephen of England was born at some time in the mid-1090s. Some historians, who are acknowledged authorities on his life and reign, argue for a year of birth as early as 1092. Others suggest he could have been born as late as 1096. It is important to bear this in mind, especially when considering the events of the 1100s and 1110s, as the gap of 4 years make a considerable difference in evaluating whether Stephen's actions at these times were those of a child, a teenager, or a young man. There is more consensus concerning his place of birth, and it is generally accepted that he was born in the town of Blois, in the Loire Valley between Orléans and Tours. Stephen's father was Stephen Henry, Count of Blois, a major French feudal lord of the late 11th century. He was already a man of about 50 years at the time of Stephen's birth. If Stephen was born in 1096, then he would have arrived after his father had left for the Holy Land to take part in the First Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian cause. Stephen's mother was Adela of Normandy. She was born in the second half of the 1060s and was a daughter of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who, in 1066, led a Norman army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England right around the time Adela was born. Her marriage to Stephen Henry in the early 1080s was a political union designed to forge an alliance between her father, by then King William I of England, and the Count of Blois. Her father died in 1087 and was succeeded by his son, Adela's brother, King William II, better known as William Rufus, most likely in reference to his red hair or beard. Hence, when Stephen was born in the mid-1090s, his uncle was the King of England. Stephen's wider family exerted influence beyond England itself. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he was already Duke of Normandy and had extended his rule over some other adjoining territories in northern France as well, such that the family controlled lands on both sides of the English Channel. Indeed, the Conqueror considered his primary role to be that of Duke of Normandy, even after conquering England, and he spent much of the 1070s and 1080s in France, even after becoming ruler of England. After his death, his territories did not pass undivided to William Rufus. Instead, the Conqueror's other sons, Robert and Henry, played the greater role in Normandy and the other French territories, while William Rufus ruled England. This arrangement was scuppered in August 1100 when the king was killed during a suspicious hunting accident in the New Forest in Hampshire in England. When this occurred, his brother Henry quickly moved to seize power and became the new monarch as King Henry I of England. With this, Stephen, who was still a child, aged between 4 and 8, depending on his year of birth, swapped having one uncle as King of England for another, while his third uncle, Robert, would exercise control over Normandy for some years to come. Although in 1106 he was defeated militarily by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Consequently, much of Stephen's life would be lived in the shadow of his powerful uncle, who, from 1106 onwards, controlled England and the family's territories in Normandy and elsewhere in northern France. As with any monarch of the High Middle Ages, there are only a small number of administrative records or examples of correspondence that has survived for the near millennium since Stephen's time, with which to shed light on his life. As a result, we are largely reliant on the histories and chronicles of the era in order to reconstruct the events which involved Stephen and the role he played in them. These were mostly written by ecclesiastical figures, monks or abbots and bishops, who were close to those in power. One was the Historia Novella, or New History of William of Malmesbury, a highly learned monk who was born in the mid-1090s too, and was an exact contemporary of Stephen's. The Benedictine monk Orderic Vitalis wrote an ecclesiastical history which covers the period up to 1141 and sheds extensive light on Stephen's life prior to becoming King of England and the first years of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long account of the history of medieval England, provides an illuminating narrative of how damaged the social and economic fabric of England was by the civil wars of the 1140s, to which, as we will see, Stephen was so central. Finally, the Gesta Stephani, or Acts of Stephen, is perhaps the greatest source of all for Stephen's time as King of England. The text was anonymous, though some historians of 12th century England contend that it was composed by Robert of Bath, the Bishop of Bath between 1136 and 1166, and an eyewitness to many of the events described in the Gesta. Unfortunately, because it could not have been predicted that Stephen would one day become King of England, these chroniclers were not paying attention to the obscure younger son of the Count of Blois in his earliest years, and we know very little about Stephen's early life. He was evidently raised at home in Blois. He had numerous siblings, including an older brother by the name of William. Under normal circumstances, in a society where primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son would succeed to a noble title, was emerging in its full form, it might have been expected that Stephen would have lived his life in the shadow of his older brother. However, William is believed to have been intellectually challenged in some way. There is no clear description of this, but he acquired the rather crude sobriquet William the Simple, which probably indicates some psychological or mental issue, one which largely precluded him from playing an active role in political and military affairs. In his stead, Stephen and his other older brother Theobald emerged early on as the most capable of Stephen Henry and Adela's sons. Another brother of theirs, Odo, died at a young age. Stephen received a decent enough education during these years by the standards of the time. Where his grandfather, William the Conqueror, was illiterate, Stephen was taught to read and write and was able to understand Latin, a sign of the Renaissance in learning which was occurring across Europe during this period as the continent's first universities were set up and began to produce new generations of scholars and teachers. Stephen's father was absent during his earliest years. He took part in the First Crusade to the Holy Land, which succeeded in setting up a number of Christian states there in 1098 and 1099. The Count of Blois's contribution to the effort was dubious, though. He was present at the siege of the city of Antioch in 1098, but he abandoned the crusade to head home at a critical juncture in the assault on the city. To compound matters, he was believed to have met with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos on his way back through Anatolia and convinced the emperor that the crusade was a lost cause and that he should not march onwards to aid the Christian armies. In the event, he proved to be completely wrong in his analysis, and after the successful capture of Antioch, the Crusaders went on to conquer nearly all of the region, approximating with modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, as well as parts of Syria and Jordan. During his absence in the east, Stephen's mother, Adela, headed up a regency government in Blois. She evidently liked the power it conveyed on her, and as soon as her husband arrived back to France, she began trying to convince him to head back east on crusade as quickly as possible. He eventually agreed to do so, and in 1101 left again for the Levant. He made it to Jerusalem on this occasion, where a Crusader kingdom had been established after his premature flight home in 1098. The following year, before he could return to France, having completed his vow to visit the Holy City, he was captured by an Islamic army and executed shortly afterwards. Hence, other than a fleeting period in 1099 and 1100, when he was back in France, Stephen's memory of his father would have been almost non-existent. He grew up much closer to his mother Adela and, unusually for a noble child at the time, was raised in her household. When news of their father's death arrived to France, Stephen's older brother Theobald was made Count of Blois, though he was only 11 or 12 years old at the time, and Adela would continue to act as regent for several years to come. While Theobald had succeeded as Count of Blois on their father's death, this certainly did not preclude Stephen from aspiring to a position of authority in France or the wider world of Western Europe. This was especially the case in light of the difficult circumstances prevailing in England and Normandy. Henry I had over 20 children, but most of them were born as a result of relationships outside of marriage, and so, by the standards of medieval Europe, could not be considered as legitimate successors to his dominions. Conversely, he had left it very late to marry, not finally wedding his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, until 1100, when Henry was already into his 30s, an old age to marry by the standards of the High Middle Ages. Having married, the union did result in 2 children in quick succession, a daughter named Matilda after her mother in the spring of 1102, and a son named William Adelin in August 1103. Thereafter the marriage produced no further children, and so the succession to Henry rested principally on just one legitimate male heir, William Adelin. Given the tenuous nature of the succession and the lack of a spare male heir, Henry began taking an interest in his nephew in the 1100s. It was an indication of Stephen's promise as he grew up that his uncle increasingly viewed him as someone who might play a major role in the governance of the French part of his dominions in Normandy and adjoining territories. This promotion of young Stephen took place in the years after 1106, following Henry's defeat of his brother Robert and seizure of the Duchy of Normandy. In response to the imprisonment of Robert by Henry, King Louis VI of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, Robert's son and heir, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This placed Henry in a difficult position, as it was not easy to govern his new French territories from England. Therefore, he began constructing an alliance of friendly French nobles that would serve to protect Normandy from attacks by Louis and the other supporters of William Clito. Part of this involved courting his sister and the lords of the county of Blois, and he did so by showing favour to Adela's favourite son, Stephen. Part of this involved Stephen spending significant periods of time in the entourage of Henry when he visited Normandy and held court at Rouen there. By the late 1100s, Stephen may have been as old as 16 or 17, and so was also in a position to accompany Henry on military campaigns in northern France. He even played a leading role in 1111 in suppressing the revolt of Robert of Bellême, a Norman lord with holdings in both England and the county of Ponthieu in France. The following year, Henry knighted Stephen, by which time he was at least 16 years old and perhaps as much as 20 years. Henry's patronage and promotion of his nephew continued in the years that followed. In the mid-1110s, Stephen crossed the English Channel to visit England for the first time and was given extensive privileges there. These included the honour of Lancaster, a feudal fief in the Lancaster region of England, one which made Henry one of the premier feudal lords of the country at a very young age. Further grants of land in the Alençon region of southern Normandy and elsewhere in France followed. All of this was conspicuous. By the late 1110s, it could be argued that Henry was promoting Stephen in a highly unusual fashion, almost as one would his designated heir. Perhaps this was owing to reservations which the king held about his own son and successor. William Adelin reached his 14th year in 1117 and began the passage into his adult years by the standards of the 12th century. He may have been something of a disappointment as he grew up. One chronicler of the time described him as a pampered prince who would be swallowed up by the volatile and aggressive politics of the time, whereas Stephen showed promise. Whatever Henry's plans were, they were soon altered by events outside of everyone's control. On the 25th of November 1120, after a major meeting of the court of King Henry I in Normandy, the king, his children and illegitimate children, along with the senior aristocrats and other courtiers, began making their way back to England. The king had made other plans, but the captain of a vessel named the White Ship, Thomas Fitzstephen, made the ship available to others to make the passage across the channel. That evening, what was, by all accounts, a fairly drunken royal party, one which included the king's heir, William Adelin, and numerous courtiers and nobles, as well as several of Henry I's illegitimate children, descended on the ship. There were approximately 300 in all, more than the ship could comfortably fit. This was fortuitous for Stephen, who was with the party and decided to get off and wait for another ship to travel over to England, leaving the drunken party to head on without him. Not long afterwards, he possibly watched as the White Ship struck a large rock which was almost entirely submerged in the harbour. According to the sources we have, all but one of the passengers drowned, an unusual development given how close to the shore they were. One might have expected that more would have swum to safety. Amongst the deceased was William Adelin, King Henry's only legitimate son and heir. His death would cast the succession issue wide open, and as a close male relative of the king, Stephen would become a major player in the scheming which followed in the 1120s. In the immediate aftermath of William Adelin's death, Henry's desire for a child of his own to succeed him became evident, despite his lavish promotion of Stephen in previous years. There was only one option left: Henry's legitimate daughter, Matilda. A girl of 18, she had already been married for several years to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful feudal lord in a politically divided Germany. Despite the fact that she was a woman, and that she was absent elsewhere in Europe and had been so for many years, Henry moved to make her his heir designate in the aftermath of the disaster of the White Ship. Admittedly, he did also try to shore up the succession in other ways. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and Henry remarried shortly after the White Ship, this time to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of the Count of Louvain and a woman of perhaps little more than 17 years at the time of the marriage. The hope was that this second union with someone with many childbearing years ahead would produce a new legitimate male heir, but there was no luck on this front. The marriage would not lead to further children for Henry, the barren nature of it most likely being due to the king's own advanced years, as Adeliza would have a child many years later when she married for a second time. What this meant in the 1120s and 1130s was that Matilda remained Henry's only living, legitimate child and the heir to the throne of England. There were signs already by the mid-1120s that Matilda would be a tough sell as Henry's heir. In France itself, it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed as a queen regnant or major feudal lady, the belief being firmly entrenched that the primary duty of a ruler was as a military leader and that this precluded women from ruling. The situation was more complex in England, a country which has had numerous female monarchs over the centuries. Henry hoped to placate his feudal lords and gain their acceptance of Matilda as his heir in 1128 when, after her first husband, Emperor Henry V, died in 1125, she was remarried to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, one of the more powerful lords of northern France, whose lands lay along the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy. This backfired, though, when the unpopular Geoffrey made the lords of England and northern France even more reluctant to accept Matilda as the king's heir. The ill feeling was compounded by high levels of taxation which Henry was imposing at the time to pay for several border wars in France. Unperturbed, Henry convened gatherings of his lords, including Stephen, on several occasions between 1127 and 1131 to have them swear oaths to accept Matilda as his heir when he passed away. Despite these outward shows of obedience, a major question still hung over events. Would these oaths be honoured when the king was dead, or would the lords seek to crown a male monarch? While this political wrangling and unrest was underway, Stephen's personal situation was changing too. Like his uncle, King Henry, he had left it relatively late to marry, but eventually, in 1125, he finally married for the first time, by which time he was either at the very end of his 20s or heading on for his mid-30s, depending on the year of his birth. To further confuse matters, another Matilda was involved, the third in our story so far. Matilda of Boulogne was a daughter of Count Eustace III of Boulogne, the ruler of the Boulogne fief near Calais in the northeastern extremity of France and lying along the shores of the English Channel. The county of Boulogne was a significant polity in the cross-channel politics between England and northern France. Furthermore, Matilda's mother was Mary of Scotland, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland. Hence Matilda was a niece-in-law of King Henry, her mother having been the sister of Henry's first wife. Accordingly, the marriage was politically astute and became even more important within weeks of the wedding when Matilda's father died without a male heir and she and Stephen ascended as Count and Countess of Boulogne, further strengthening Stephen's position in northern France and on the southern side of the English Channel. From his new lordship in Boulogne, Stephen continued to position himself to be a major figure in the succession politics of the second half of the 1120s and into the 1130s. He still was highly regarded by his uncle, who had facilitated the marriage union with Matilda of Boulogne. Stephen returned the favour by acting as Henry's representative in the region straddling northern France and Flanders in what is now Belgium. Here, William Clito, the son of Henry's brother Robert, was scheming to become Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful fiefdoms in northern Europe during the High Middle Ages. Henry was anxious to prevent this, and Stephen obliged him by undermining William Clito's efforts. This all stood in stark contrast to Henry's relationship with his daughter and heir Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou. They were pressuring Henry to begin transferring power to them before he died, principally by handing over control of castles and lands in northern France. Their argument that this would facilitate the succession to Matilda once Henry died was reasonable, but Henry did not view it as such, and the final years of his life saw a perceptible tension between the king and his daughter and son-in-law. It was under this cloud of deteriorating relations with his family members that old King Henry died at the start of December 1135. Chroniclers of the time suggested his demise was owing to eating too many lampreys, a type of fish. Perhaps this did play a part in his death, but in any event, Henry was well into his 60s by that time, and an old man by the standards of the 12th century. As news of the king's death spread, Stephen was well placed to position himself as a potential successor. The king had died in Normandy, and Stephen received the news before most other contenders for the throne, as he was not far away in Bologna at the time. Geoffrey and Matilda were further south in Anjou, and such was their unpopularity by that time that few supporters rushed to their cause. Another plausible successor was Stephen's brother Theobald, the Count of Blois, though it soon transpired that he too lacked the kind of support which was available to Stephen. Stephen moved swiftly to capitalize on his advantageous position. He and his closest followers mobilized and quickly crossed the English Channel to arrive in England within days of Henry's death. There they faced some opposition from Matilda's supporters. Nevertheless, by the 8th of December, Stephen was near London, and in the days that followed cemented popular support for his accession in the capital and began taking over the levers of government. Over the next week, an agreement was worked out with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbeil, whereby, in spite of the Archbishop's oath to support Matilda's succession, he agreed to crown Stephen as the senior ecclesiastical Lord of England. Then a story was concocted with some of the late king's senior ministers, through which it was claimed that Henry I had renounced Matilda as his heir on his deathbed and approved Stephen as his successor. Then, with the wheeling and dealing done and those in positions of power convinced to support him, Stephen was officially crowned as King Stephen I of England at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135. It was just 3 weeks to the day since King Henry's death, and in France, Matilda was able to do very little to try to alter the trajectory of events. It was not the end of her claim to the throne, though. Far from it. In a somewhat unusual development, Stephen did not initially face military difficulties from rival candidates to the throne of England from northern France. Instead, the first 2 to 3 years of his reign were principally concerned with shoring up his position in England itself from fractious lords within England and border incursions from Wales and Scotland. The most pressing issue was to the north, where King David I of Scotland had taken advantage of the temporary lull in English royal power upon the death of King Henry to invade northern England. The lands here around Northumbria and adjoining shires were contested between the English and the Scots throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, and a diplomatic realignment pursuant from a change of king was a common reason for outbreaks of hostilities along the border. This one was more substantial than others, with David marching well into England and seizing the important northern towns of Carlisle and Newcastle. In response, Stephen marched north early in 1136 and campaigned against the Scots. Clashes over several weeks were enough to convince both monarchs of the wisdom of finding a swift solution. Stephen, who was anxious to end the campaign and return south in order to continue consolidating his position, ceded Carlisle to David in return for peace. With this concluded, Stephen headed south again. No sooner had he returned southwards than Stephen had to engage with an incursion from several Welsh lords into the March region between eastern Wales and the English West Midlands. The Normans had begun efforts to conquer Wales during the reign of Stephen's grandfather, William the Conqueror, but this was only ever a partial conquest and would not be fully completed until the late 13th century. While Stephen was absent in the north, campaigning against the Scots, several Welsh lords revolted, winning a significant victory at the Battle of Llwchor in January 1136. By the summer of 1136, there was a full revolt in progress in South Wales, led by figures like Owain Gwynedd, one of the Welsh princes. Stephen and several Norman marcher lords campaigned aggressively against them in the months that followed, but as with the Scottish border, Stephen was not committed to winning victory, merely to limiting any potential damage which war might cause. In 1137, he agreed peace terms through which the English state left the Welsh lords to manage themselves for a generation to come. That Stephen would make no further effort to intervene in Wales over his reign was owing to the outbreak of the civil war which would characterize both his reign and the entirety of English political history for a decade and a half in the middle of the 12th century. The Anarchy began in 1138, a civil war which pitted Stephen and his supporters against those who wished to uphold old King Henry's desire for his legitimate daughter, Matilda, to succeed him. Matilda and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had been committed to challenging Stephen's accession from the very beginning of the reign, but it was not until 1138 that they were in a position to press their cause. The Civil War was ignited when two very powerful English lords agreed to join their cause. These were Robert, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of King Henry I, and thus a half-brother of Matilda's. He was one of the leading peers of the realm, and had made clear from the very beginning that he was uneasy with the manner in which Stephen had usurped the throne in December 1135. In 1138, he agreed to take up arms in support of Matilda. Second was Ranulph de Gernon, 4th Earl of Chester. He was a leading Anglo-Norman magnate. Some of his lands in the north of England had been sacrificed by Stephen as the price of peace with the Scots in 1136, and his resentment at this led him to join the revolt when it began in 1138. Thus, with support from senior lords on both sides of the English Channel, Matilda and Geoffrey entered open conflict with Stephen. The first stages of the war occurred in 1139 when the Angevins, so named for the fact that Matilda's husband was the Count of Anjou, invaded England from northern France. With the die cast, Matilda's supporters made their allegiances clear. The dead King Henry's widow, Adeliza, also threw her support behind her stepdaughter. In the months that followed and into 1140, the battle lines were drawn as Matilda's faction won control over much of northern England, where Ranulph of Chester was one of the preeminent feudal lords, and in western England, with the port city of Bristol emerging as a stronghold for Matilda in the region, buoyed by Robert of Gloucester's strong position here. Meanwhile, Stephen retained control of the bulk of southern and eastern England, a position which gave him control of London, Oxford, and the wealthier parts of England around Kent and Surrey in the south, as well as into East Anglia and beyond. Although some parts of the country would be gained and lost by both Stephen and Matilda's supporters over the years, this was the general geopolitical situation which would pertain for much of the civil war that was just beginning. Yet, often the map was more complicated still, as local lords and magnates, or even church figures like the Bishop of Ely, gained control of small patches of land and shifted allegiances over and back as they tried to benefit themselves during the prolonged period of uncertainty. It was this chaotic situation, combined with the violence and the breakdown of royal government, which partly led to the Civil War becoming known as the Anarchy. One of the most critical episodes in the entire war began in the first days of 1141, when Stephen and his followers laid siege to Lincoln Castle, where Ranulph of Chester and some of his closest supporters were lodging. Stephen hoped to win this key stronghold lying between East Anglia and York in the north. At first, Ranulph seemed to be caught unprepared, but the move soon turned against Stephen when, at the start of February 1141, Robert of Gloucester arrived to Lincoln to relieve the siege and to try to strike a decisive blow against Stephen's cause. The resulting Battle of Lincoln was one of the most important clashes of the entire Civil War, though it probably involved little more than 1,000 men on either side, an indication of the limited nature of warfare in 12th century England. Gloucester and his allies had the better of it, owing to a large contingent of Welsh auxiliaries who had joined Matilda's cause in 1139. As their position became clear, many of Stephen's most important knights and allies fled from the field, and the battle soon turned into little more than an effort by Stephen and a small band of knights to try and fight their way to safety. They did not succeed, and by the time the clash ended, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester were not just victorious, but had managed to capture Stephen as well. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken back as a prisoner by Gloucester to the West Midlands and was presented to Matilda. She ordered his confinement in Bristol Castle, and deliberations were now entered into as to what should be done. Matilda had seemingly won a clear victory, but Stephen was a crowned and anointed king, and in both canon and common law could not simply be dispensed with without a clear legal justification. Hence, several weeks of negotiations followed in which several senior archbishops and bishops of the English Church indicated their willingness to support Stephen's deposition and the crowning of Matilda as queen, though others refused. In the end, the breakthrough came when Stephen indicated from his confinement at Bristol that his supporters should allow Matilda to become queen. In the circumstances, he probably felt he had little choice, and so in April 1141, Stephen was to all intents and purposes deposed, and Matilda became queen. Unusually, she took the title Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English, rather than Queen, while many chroniclers of the High Middle Ages and for centuries afterwards referred to her as Empress Matilda rather than Queen Matilda, a designation owing to her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and her position as his empress. Matilda also continued to use the title long after leaving Germany. This uncertainty around her title reflected the realities of her limited power. When Matilda and her supporters attempted to descend on London to have her crowned at Westminster, the Londoners rejected her and remained steadfast in their loyalty to Stephen. In this fluid situation, with Matilda having emerged temporarily victorious over Stephen, the king himself imprisoned, though with parts of England refusing to acknowledge Matilda, the political landscape in northern France also experienced an important change. When news reached the county of Anjou of the defeat and capture of Stephen at Lincoln, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, invaded the Duchy of Normandy and occupied much of it. Stephen's older brother, Theobald, Count of Blois, did very little to stop him, being conscious of both the difficulty of withstanding the Angevin onslaught with Stephen's fortunes in such decline in England, and also having his own troubles to contend with against the French monarchy. The Angevins would retain control over most of Normandy throughout the 1140s and into the early 1150s, and henceforth the civil war would largely be contained to England itself. Geoffrey of Anjou was even able to have himself formally acknowledged by many of the Norman lords as Duke of Normandy in 1144. Stephen's cause was at an extremely low ebb in the spring of 1141. However, all was not lost. Though captive himself, his wife Matilda of Boulogne proved herself to be a capable leader of his cause while Stephen was being held at Bristol, and she soon managed to reassemble an alliance of some of England's leading magnates to resist Matilda's ascension to power, aided considerably by Stephen's brother Henry, Bishop of Winchester. They also had the support of William of Ypres, the leader of a major contingent of Flemish mercenaries from the Low Countries. In the autumn of 1141, their combined forces marched towards Winchester, where Matilda and Gloucester's armies were trying to secure the region for her and have the lords there acknowledge Matilda's accession as queen. What followed at Winchester on the 14th of September 1141 was a direct inversion of the result at the Battle of Lincoln 7 months earlier. Matilda's forces were routed and heavily defeated, and Robert of Gloucester was taken captive. In the aftermath of the engagement, Matilda of Boulogne and Bishop Henry of Winchester were able to trade Gloucester's release for the release of Stephen. Set at liberty at the beginning of November 1141, Stephen began to re-establish himself as king, and in December he and his wife undertook a second coronation as a means of reaffirming Stephen's position as King of England and in an effort to delegitimize Matilda's accession months earlier. Matilda was never formally deposed, and so across the 1140s there was a rival queen regnant in the shape of Empress Matilda and a king regnant in the shape of King Stephen. The anarchy would continue unabated for many years to come, despite the dramatic events of 1141. Having fortuitously gained his freedom in the late autumn of 1141 and begun to restore his authority, it all nearly came to a shuddering halt for Stephen the following year. Early in 1142, he fell seriously ill. What caused his illness has never been satisfactorily resolved. It could well have been the case that the circumstances of his imprisonment at Bristol Castle for several months the previous year had weakened his system and left him ill. The conditions might have been such that pneumonia or all manner of other sicknesses are possible. Whatever the cause, it is clear that contemporaries believed that Stephen was on the verge of death in the spring of 1142. Then, somewhat miraculously, he made a swift recovery and began an energetic new military campaign one in which he managed to win over Ranulph of Chester for a brief time to his side in the war before laying siege to Oxford in the autumn of 1142. Empress Matilda was there at the time, and Stephen very nearly captured her, something which would have surely led to a major shift in the course of the war had he done so. It was not to be, though. Matilda and a handful of close supporters slipped out of Oxford Castle under the cover of night and made their way westwards. After the dramatic events of the years between 1140 and 1142, the years that followed in the mid-1140s saw the Civil War enter into a period of stalemate. Neither side made a major breakthrough, although at the same time there were near-constant clashes between regional supporters of both Stephen and Matilda's causes. The conflict was extremely damaging, and many chroniclers of the time noted the devastation wrought across England and northern France. Agriculture was interrupted across the Norman dominions, and there was a general economic decline after a lengthy period of improvement under Henry I. Scores of castles were destroyed and towns and villages sacked brutally by wandering bands of soldiers on both sides of the divide. It was this general sense of a land experiencing devastation for years which led the chroniclers to lament it so much, and for subsequent historians to term it the Anarchy. Like many modern wars, it also led to innovations. The incessant warfare and the destruction of existing motte and bailey wooden castles led to a swift adoption of the new concept of stronger stone castles, particularly in England, where motte and bailey fortifications still dotted the countryside. As destructive as the Anarchy was, it ushered in a period in the second half of the 12th century and into the 13th and 14th in which some of England's finest stone castles were erected. By this time, Stephen was entering his 50s, and Matilda was also well into her 40s. Therefore, as the Anarchy continued, the focus of it shifted in the course of the 1140s from Stephen and his cousin as rival contenders for the throne to their own offspring. Stephen and his wife Matilda of Boulogne had several children by then. Their eldest son, Eustace, was born around 1130. From the point at which Stephen claimed the throne of England in December 1135, Eustace was the next in line to become King of England, though clearly his position politically was marginal while still a child. By the mid-1140s, however, he was old enough to be promoted and was expected to engage in military campaigning himself. In 1146, he was promoted to the position of Count of Boulogne in France and knighted not long afterwards as his father began preparing him to succeed him one day. Stephen and Matilda also had a daughter named Marie who was born in 1136. In the late 1140s, Stephen began promoting her to play a prominent role in the female religious orders in England, a position which was essentially political in the High Middle Ages. Such was the power and wealth of the medieval religious orders. Another son, William, was married to Isabel de Warenne, the only legitimate child of William de Warenne, 3rd Earl of Surrey, in 1148, just a few months after Surrey had died. With this, William was promoted to become Earl of Surrey, through marriage at just 11 years of age. Finally, like his uncle Henry I, Stephen also had illegitimate children, the foremost of which was a son named Gervase, who Stephen had made the abbot of Westminster Abbey in 1138, an important ecclesiastical office which he abused through his corrupt behaviour. All of this was designed to embed Stephen's wider family into the political and aristocratic world of England and to shore up his dynasty in the process. A similar situation was developing across the English Channel in the county of Anjou. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons in the 1130s. Chief amongst these was their eldest son, Henry, an heir who became known to the chroniclers of the time as Henry Fitz-Empress, Fitz meaning son of, and the Empress referring to his mother's first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and continuing use of the title of Empress. Henry was born in March 1133 and was just a few years younger than Stephen's eldest son Eustace. Already by 1142, when he was just 9 years of age, his parents began involving Henry in the politics of the Civil War and sent him to England to spend time in the household of his step-uncle Robert of Gloucester. The point of this was to present in person Matilda's heir to the English lords who supported her cause. Henry, after all, would be her successor one day if she was to emerge victorious in the Civil War. And this is increasingly how the Civil War began to develop in the second half of the 1140s and into the early 1150s. It was no longer a conflict to see if Stephen or Matilda would rule in the long run, but which might emerge victorious in their old age and ensure the succession of their son Eustace of Boulogne or Henry of Anjou. The 2 sons became more central to the military campaigning as the years went by, especially on Matilda's side, after her second husband and Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in September 1151, at which juncture young Henry became the de facto head of Matilda's military campaign. Even as the caste of those who were involved in the fighting changed, it remained a somewhat timid affair, such that several historians of the High Middle Ages have questioned whether we should even speak of a continuation of the Civil War in the late 1140s. One feature of this was the death of Robert of Gloucester in October 1147. With the passing of one of Matilda's foremost supporters in England, the political and military landscape changed further, so that Stephen and his allies were now more secure in their control of England, while Matilda and the supporters of the Angevins continued to control the Norman dominions across northern France. Another development was that the Second Crusade to the Holy Land began in 1145 and lasted down to 1149 in response to the conquest of the county of Edessa by the Muslim powers of the Levant in 1144. This drew many of the lords and soldiers who might have continued the war between Stephen and Matilda away from Western Europe to the east. In this environment, Henry tried to launch several invasions of England in the second half of the 1140s, but these amounted to very little. In one instance, Stephen simply paid off the mercenaries that Henry's army was largely comprised of and ordered them to return home to France. The final stages in the anarchy came in the early 1150s. By then, Stephen's position had been somewhat weakened owing to a dispute which had emerged between him and the church authorities in England since the mid-1140s, while Ranulph of Chester continued to hold control over large stretches of the north of England. In 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress, who by then had succeeded as Count of Anjou, and was able to deploy greater resources than on previous occasions, arrived to England again, where he built up support around Bristol and the surrounding region for his and his mother's cause. A period of pronounced military engagement and clashes followed over several months, much of it focused on a siege of Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire on the periphery of Henry and Stephen's spheres of control. Something very unusual happened at this juncture. Many of Stephen and Henry's closest supporters now indicated an unwillingness to participate in a new bout of violent engagements which could destabilize England in a way not seen since the early 1140s. Faced with this unprecedented situation, Stephen and Henry entered negotiations which were brokered by leading members of the English Church. The end result was the Treaty of Wallingford, also known as the Treaty of Winchester, which was agreed at the scene of the siege late in 1153. Under the terms of this, Stephen, who knew that he now faced a young, energetic and capable enemy in the shape of Henry, and who was also in a difficult position when it came to church support in England, agreed that Henry would succeed him when he died, something which many people assumed was not many years away, given that Stephen was around 60 years of age by that time. This involved Stephen abandoning the claims of his sons to succeed him as King of England, but would ensure peace during Stephen's final years. The Wallingford Agreement was confirmed shortly afterwards by a more formal treaty agreed upon at Winchester. The Treaty of Wallingford was a peculiar agreement. Through it, Stephen had effectively renounced the claims of his son Eustace or any of his other children to the throne of England. Eustace was clearly disgruntled with the decision, though there is a debate as to whether or not Stephen did genuinely intend to accept the terms of the treaty, or if he was simply buying time in which to strengthen his position again and would then recommence the war and impose Eustace as his heir. This latter theory certainly corresponds with some of his actions following the agreement. The months after Wallingford was finalised saw Stephen engaging in a flurry of activity. First, he tried to reduce the power of Hugh Bigod, a perennially overmighty feudal lord in England, while he was also building up his military base once again. A setback occurred when Eustace died suddenly and prematurely in the autumn of 1153, though Stephen's other son, William, now became a potential heir to Stephen. Questions remain as to whether Stephen was planning to eventually renounce the terms of the Wallingford Agreement and to try and make William his heir once he had built up enough strength and support for such a move. If this was Stephen's plan, it would never come to fruition. By the time the Wallingford Agreement was reached in 1153, the king was at least 57 years of age, depending on the time of his birth, and perhaps into his early 60s. Old age in the 12th century. Despite his advanced years, he spent the first months of 1154 travelling around England and making preparations for reform of the kingdom and perhaps to plot the succession of his son William. One major port of call was the northern city of York. He then traversed the entire country again, heading for Dover in Kent in the southeast of England. It is plausible that this extensive travel exacerbated some pre-existing illnesses, although Stephen's death may also have been entirely unexpected. In any event, we do know that he fell ill after reaching Kent, complaining of a stomach ailment, and died shortly thereafter on the 25th of October 1154. The exact cause of his death remains unclear. An ailment such as stomach cancer or severe gastritis may have been involved. He was quickly buried at Faversham Abbey in Kent. Stephen had patronised the establishment of the abbey just a few years earlier, and both his wife Matilda and their eldest son Eustace, who had died only so recently, were also interred there. The abbey was dissolved and largely destroyed in 1538 as part of the dissolution of England's monasteries during the English Reformation. In 1964, the empty tombs of Stephen and his family members were discovered, and there is a lack of clarity as to where their remains ended up after the 1530s, with local law contending their bones were thrown into a local creek. Stephen's death occurred at a broadly propitious time for bringing the long-running civil war to an end. Eustace's death a year earlier had ensured there was no power struggle between him and Henry, which there surely would have been had both men still been alive when Stephen died. Furthermore, with the Treaty of Wallingford having only so recently been negotiated, the other potential claimants to the throne were willing to accept Henry's succession as King Henry II of England. This new period of England's history is known as the Angevin Empire, to indicate Henry's descent through the House of Anjou and the extent of his territorial holdings on both sides of the English Channel. Under other circumstances, some of England's nobles might have encouraged Stephen's younger son, William, to push his claims to the throne, but after nearly 2 decades of civil war and destruction, peace was broadly favoured by all. Henry II settled into a long reign. He would rule as King of England until 1189, though in time his own fractious family would sow disorder across England and Normandy, while the succession of his son John as king in 1199 ushered in an era in which the Angevins lost the bulk of their lands in northern France. Periods of civil war and disorder would punctuate England's medieval history every few decades for centuries to come. King Stephen has often been viewed poorly by historians of England and France in the High Middle Ages. The reasons for this are obvious. His long reign of nearly 2 decades was a period of near-continuous civil war, societal disruption, and economic destruction across England, so much so that it is known as the Anarchy. The chronicles and histories of the time present a picture of a country ravaged by the conflict between the supporters of Stephen and Matilda. Many historians since have understandably laid the blame for much of this on Stephen. And yet this is possibly unfair. The crisis was created by a succession dispute which was generated to a large extent by the nobles of England and northern France, who were unwilling to accept Matilda as the successor to Henry I. Had they done so, the chaos could have been avoided. When it did begin, it was perpetuated by Matilda, Geoffrey, and then their son Henry. Stephen certainly played a part in all of this, but he was just one player in the whole sorry saga. Conversely, Henry I's promotion of him and the attitude of a great many feudal lords of England and northern France towards him would surely seem to indicate that Stephen was a capable figure of many good qualities. What was really at issue were structural weaknesses in the English and Norman state in the 12th century, and also the sheer happenstance of family creation. If Henry I had sired more legitimate sons, the anarchy would almost certainly have been avoided. That this wasn't the case was not Stephen's fault, though there is no doubting his centrality to the years of war and discord which followed the death of Henry I. What do you think of King Stephen? Was he responsible for the anarchy, or was he more of a symptom than a cause of the weaknesses of the Norman state in the 12th century? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.